Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Sarah Lazare. Sarah is a web editor at In These Times. She comes from a background in independent journalism and has written for publications including The Intercept, The Nation, and Tom Dispatch. I met Sarah during the Bush years doing anti-war activism with Iraq Veterans Against the War, the Civilian Soldier Alliance, and other groups. So it's good to have you here in a different venue.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Right on. So let's jump straight into it. Tell us a little bit about who you are, sort of where you grew up, how you got into activism, and what led us to obviously eventually meeting when you were doing anti-war work during the Bush years.
Yeah, so I was born in Chicago. We lived in Sharon, Massachusetts for a little while when I was a kid, but I mostly grew up in Springfield, Illinois. I got into activism largely thanks to the fact that I'm a red diaper baby, which means my parents were radicals. My father spent about 8 years as part of the Back to the Factory movement with the Socialist Workers' Party. That was during a time when a lot of socialists and communists were going into factories intentionally as part of an effort to build the membership of their organization. So my dad worked in a garment factory in Chicago trying to organize people for socialism for 8 years. He got really burnt out by the experience and ended up changing some of his ideas, but nonetheless, they rubbed off on me. And I was raised in a house with bookshelves filled with radical thinkers and got to talk to my parents, who both have a pretty radical critique of the ills of society. So that was one of my big entry points. But the thing that really got me sort of moving and doing things was in high school, I read about the 1999 protests in Seattle against the World Trade Organization and participated in some solidarity demonstrations in Springfield. And that was just a really exciting time, in part because the 90s were really a time when it didn't feel that the left was ascendant. It felt like a bit of a lull. And then all of a sudden there were, people storming the most powerful forces on earth and winning and shutting down a big summit meeting and capturing national headlines. So for someone like me who always had a real taste for radical activism, I was just totally amazed at that moment. Just one other political thing I did before that was in high school, I wrote political zines, and a zine is a homemade do-it-yourself magazine, often using sort of a cut and paste aesthetic where you solicit submissions from friends. And so that was one early form of activist involvement that predated the sort of anti-WTO global justice movement.
What got you heavy into the anti-war movement? I mean, was it just the natural process of things because there were so many people during the Bush years that had, become involved with the movement?
Yeah, I got involved with the anti-war movement in the lead up to the Afghanistan war when I was in college, and then especially in the lead up to the Iraq war. I just remember, especially in the build-up to the Iraq War, when there were tremendously large protests all over the world was very clearly saying no to that war, yet it still happened, and it was still this horrific event. I'll never forget watching, so-called shock and awe on television and just trying to wrap my head around the horrific acts on a tremendous scale that was happening. And I think I just got involved because it just seems so wrong and so blatant, such a blatant defiance of what the entire world was demanding, which was no war. But I didn't, so I did a lot of organizing and protesting sort of around the beginning of the Afghanistan war and then the lead up to the Iraq war. But then a lot of people, I sort of ended up stepping back a little bit. In part, honestly, it was a little demoralizing to see such massive historic protests not have an impact and not effectively end the wars. But then I sort of refound a way to connect in a way that felt really powerful and meaningful with the anti-war veteran and the GI resistance movement. And I got involved in that around 2008 and then became heavily involved in that end of things, from about 2008 to maybe 2014 or so. And the whole idea behind that was that you can actually organize people to withdraw their labor and withdraw their consent from the war to stop the military machine from churning. And it felt really powerful to sort of directly address the people who were being sent off as cannon fodder in these wars, and to find out that a lot of them oppose the war, or a lot of them are really angry with how they're being treated, and a lot of them come from working class backgrounds, and a lot of them are among the communities of color who are disproportionately targeted, and to sort of organize with that community was just very powerful and transformative for me.
I think about those years in many different ways. I mean, there's a lot I learned during those years that I've taken with me. There's a lot of, I think, mistakes that I made during those years that I've tried to learn from. What do you think are some of the maybe overall, because we can move on after this, but I want to sort of get into why, how you got into writing. And I remember reading your stuff all the way back to like writing for ZNet and all kinds of different outlets. But what do you think are some of the lessons from that period? I mean, we know that militarism hasn't ended. Unfortunately, the wars are still going on. I think a lot of us, feel demoralized that there's not a more explicit sort of anti-war movement, though we see other movements connecting these things. I mean, we see the movement for Black Lives connecting domestic militarism to militarism overseas. We see environmental movement connecting ecological devastation and climate change to militarism and empire. But we don't necessarily have that and I maybe the question is we need to think about it differently. Maybe there isn't going to be like the traditional anti-war movement the way that we once thought of it. But I guess those are two questions. One would be, what are the lessons you think we could take away from that period of anti-war work, or how do you think about that period and now in hindsight? And then two, what do you think that means for us today in terms of, connecting those issues of militarism and the wars, which still seem so, distant and sort of ignored, not, by everyone, but by a large section of the public, which is understandable because it's not on the news every day and it's not in everyone's faces.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and honestly would love to hear your thoughts on it too, because I think it's a really hard one, and I still ask myself a lot, what are the lessons that I can draw from that time? I think that the strategy of organizing service members to withdraw their support from the war is a powerful and good one, and has especially a lot of potential to sort of change people's minds and subvert this glorification of veterans being used for the purposes of upholding endless war. But I also think that for it to actually be effective at stopping the machinery of war, it needs to happen on a very large scale. It's really hard organizing. It's organizing that requires a lot of support. I think that it can be really tough and challenging for active duty people who have been really traumatized and decide to go public and ethically object to deployment, to suddenly be thrust in the public spotlight and be doing a million news interviews and sort of front and center. I think that moving forward, it would be really good to take a little bit more care and make sure people are going to be okay and are pacing themselves and are not being put in the limelight before they understand what that means. It means, I think you just need to take really good care. And, I have my own reflections about people who I wonder whether I could have done more to support them when they suddenly found themselves in the spotlight. And, I think base building is really important, figuring out what organizing drives that are anti-war can look like and how they can mobilize. against forces that are on such a grand scale is a very, very hard question. You know, like when your target is the US military, which is the most powerful and violent institution in the whole entire world, that's a very daunting task. So I just want to acknowledge that it's very hard organizing, but I think it's really important, and I think it's important to figure out how to translate like numbers in the streets to ongoing sustainable base building work. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, and I after this I can share some thoughts about relevance today. But I'd be curious to know what lessons you draw from that time.
There's a lot. I mean, I think one of them, you mentioned base building, and it seems clear to me now doing the community-focused organizing that we're doing here in the community space that it was an ongoing, how do I put this? The easiest way to put this would be that I think we were stuck in some of the details you mentioned. I definitely agree with. In fact, I feel probably somewhat, what would I say? I found that period to be troubling. And it's funny because actually one of the first interviews that I can remember doing was with Joel Bufus from In These Times. I don't know if he's still with In These Times, but Joel. Yeah. So Joel called my phone. I think Aaron Hughes or somebody gave him my number, and I was at like a pizza place in Northwest Indiana, like drinking beer, and he was like, "I want to ask you these questions." And I did the interview, and I just remember being like, "I just did an interview. Like this working class kid from Northwest Indiana, like I never thought anyone would want to interview me about anything." And it was this weird, like, at first it was an empowering thing. And then after a while, your point about burning people out with the media stuff and the exposure and the speeches and people either showering you with praise in weird ways or like putting you in this position where they think that because you're in front of a camera or in front of a microphone that you actually have some kind of wisdom or knowledge about organizing, when in reality all I was doing was trying to like convey this moral message about like what I had participated in and sort of bear witness to those, atrocities. I think of Jane McAlevy's work a lot. I really like Jane McAlevy's work. I find it very helpful in terms of trying to like differentiate between different forms of activism. And so when I read her book, No Shortcuts, I remember thinking to myself, oh, wow, a lot of what we were doing was mobilizing, like constant mobilizing without the deep organizing, base building, and relationship building that you need to make those mobilizations more successful. And that made a lot of sense to me because I remember going to a lot of anti-war events while I was doing stuff with IVAW. And then coming home to Northwest Indiana, like most of these events were, as you know, Washington, D.C., Chicago, New York, etc. But then coming back home to Indiana and being like, why do I feel so detached? Like there was something missing where it was like, okay, I'm going to these large mobilizations, but then the community in which I live, like we don't have a base of anti-war supporters. Like we had self-identified activists, like self-identified radicals and progressives, Code Pink, Veterans for Peace. Those things existed in Northwest Indiana, but we never bridged that gap between mobilizing and building that deep organizing base building on one end. And the last thing I'll say, because this could go on, this could be our whole conversation today. The last thing I will say is that we never, you mentioned it a few times, but we never, I think, really had deep discussions about what would the strategy actually look like. So one path would be GIs withholding labor. I don't think we ever really found a way to create those international connections. Like we have 800 to 1,000 military bases around the world. There's a lot of activists in other countries who want those military bases gone. There's probably pressure they could place on the U.S. government in terms of relationships and different, whatever the agreements may be. I've often thought about what the connection with labor would be. Like if I could go back, what kind of intentional conversations would we have with the Longshoremen's Union, with railroad workers, with pilots, with flight attendants, like people who have the ability to sort of shut down those means of distribution of resources, military goods. And it's funny because I spoke with Medea Benjamin about this, and she mentioned that she thought there was too much emphasis on the connection between U.S. militarism and the economic cost at home. And I kind of remembered it somewhat differently, where I was thinking we were around a lot of people who were doing like maybe too much moralizing and not enough like connecting this to people's real material needs, where like we were going around, I feel like with IVAW for a long time, sort of telling people just how horrific war was and how terrible it was that the Iraqi people, what was happening to the Iraqi and Afghan people. And that's true, but I do think that sometimes is very difficult for people sitting at home to go, well, I know it's terrible, but shit, I'm working 2 jobs and my kids are, you know, either starving or can barely make it. And I've got all these stresses. So like adding this, to your point, even thinking about it is overwhelming. So then to be living in like an overwhelmingly like difficult situation, which a lot of poor and working class people in this country are, and then to add that on top of it, and then to think like, God, I know this is bad, but to connect it in a more real way with people, I think could have helped us build that base. And the last thing I'll mention is that the anti-war movement was largely older, middle class, upper middle class, and white. And I do think that posed problems. And that's not to, you know, a lot of people in that movement did not want that to be the case. So it's not like, you know, there were people who I think really did want to change that. But I think it's hard to start out with a movement that is disproportionately white, and then to try and change that into a more diverse organization that's representative. Anyway, those are all long explanations.
No, I feel all of that. And I know that there were a lot of people who tried to sort of change that demographic and open space for younger people and people of color. There were a lot of efforts to build solidarity with people in Iraq, for example. And, you know, it was sometimes really hard and mishandled and fraught, but nonetheless, people tried very hard at doing that. And I think those are areas where it continues to make sense to try very hard.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I don't want to make it sound like there weren't people in the movement doing those things, because you're absolutely right. There were. I mean, I mentioned Aaron Hughes. Aaron was one of the first people who came to me and was like, what would more strategic organizing look like? I mean, he was the first one who mentioned it. I just wasn't in the place. I was probably too young and immature to even process what he was saying. And I think after all of those years of doing the work, you know, you just get into that frustrated mode where you're like, yeah, but like we just need more people, or let's do this, or a more radical action. And you know, it's like sometimes you have to take a step back to then process what you're doing and to be like, okay, what was working, what's not working. I mean, we could see it even with our local work. We've been so like nose to the grindstone for the last 3 or 4 years that just this last 4 months to being able to step back and be like, wait a minute. Like it's forced me to reflect on different approaches, methods that we're using. In some ways it helps, having a little bit of that distance. Let's switch gears a bit. I want to talk, or get you to talk about what In These Times is, sort of a little history of the publication that you work for, because I think it's one of my favorite progressive left publications in the U.S. It's, I think, one of the more important and I think reasonable ones. You guys are not dogmatic. You guys aren't coming from like a very sectarian line. I think all of that is super helpful to turn on ordinary people to politics, which is why like someone who's telling me that they just want to start learning about this stuff In These Times is one of the first publications I sent them to. So
that's great. That's good to hear. Yeah, we are a more than 40-year-old publication based in Chicago. We, like you said, try very hard to be non-sectarian. There were many years where it was declared a socialist magazine on its masthead. That's not on our masthead anymore, but there's that. Those themes are very present in the work that we do. We put a big premium on labor coverage, so covering unions, covering issues that affect workers, covering unemployment. In the U.S. media landscape, there's a tendency for a lot of media coverage to cluster on the East Coast, around New York, or the West Coast, but we put a pretty high premium on rural America, on looking at what's happening in the Midwest, looking at small towns or medium-sized Midwestern cities that are often overlooked. On top of our sort of workers' rights and economic justice coverage, we do coverage of war and militarism. We do coverage of national and international politics. We're trying very hard to do more climate coverage. I think we have been making the assessment that this is a critical area that intersects with all other political areas. It intersects with workers' rights and international politics and militarism and everything. So we're trying to really build that. One of the things we've been trying to do in particular is look at opportunities to build with workers around issues of climate and sort of talk about what a just transition could look like and where are areas where workers are doing organizing specifically around climate and what are some of the challenges and we try to be very honest in our coverage. We want to both like cheer on good organizing efforts, but not paint them with an overly rosy picture. And we try to have really honest conversations about problems and disagreements within movements. Our print magazine has a whole Up for Debate section where we try to host debates that are like very present in movements at that time. So we don't believe in shying away from debate. We believe in trying to have a like good faith, high road discussion about disagreement. So
I think it's one of the best aspects of In These Times.
Thanks, I'm glad.
I mean, seriously, we live in a very, I've been, anyway, it would go off into something different, but I think, even, I've been seeing like right now, we have the elections coming up and there are many different views about the elections. And I think, it's like instead of everybody hunkering down, it makes so much more sense to talk about it and then talk about it in a way, how do I put this? I see it from the younger generation. You tell me if you think that this is maybe, if this is wrong, but I think like working with these cats who are in their teens or in their early 20s, they seem somewhat more sophisticated in terms of like processing this electoral stuff, where it's like, it doesn't seem like they're just going to like throw someone out the door just because it's like, oh, you vote for the Democrat and I don't, or I believe in strategic voting in this way, but you don't. And so therefore, like, I don't know. I see in other words, I see more vicious debates with some of the lefties I know who are like been doing this for 30 or 40 years than I do with people who are just getting involved they seem way more sophisticated than I was at that age. I guess that's what I'm saying. And so I think like there's some kind of there does seem to be like a yearning for more of that debate in like a constructive way without the horizontal hostility.
Yeah. I'm very impressed with the radicalism and sort of rigor of young people in general. Polling shows that younger generations are more hostile to capitalism. Younger generations are out in the streets right now leading the like nationwide uprising against racism and police. That's something that gives me a lot of hope at a time where it can be kind of hard to hold on to hope because the world is kind of a mess. Yeah.
Do you have folks on the staff or writing that are younger?
Yeah. We have some staff who are in their 20s, and we work with a constellation of freelancers who are all over the map. I would say we're pretty intergenerational. I think that like everyone from every age group brings something, and we work with a lot of really wonderful younger people. We have this interview coming out that I'm really excited about with members of Asada's Daughters, feminist Black liberation organization in Chicago. And it's a conversation among their young leaders about sort of what abolitionist organizing looks like in practice. And that'll be out in a few days. I'm very excited about that. We also work with, people who are in their 70s who have been doing this a long time and bring the perspective of that whole lifetime of experience. So I'm excited by it in these times as like intergenerational aspect.
Yeah. No, 100%. I mean, our friend Bill Fletcher, I know, just wrote an article in there. So it's nice to see everyone from Bill to yourself, others. Um, is there anything else you want to mention about the magazine, just in case people could, like, so you have both your online and you have print.
Mm-hmm.
And how could people just plug in? I know we should probably do this at the end, but we'll do it now because we're talking about it.
Well, I'll just say our website is inthesetimes.com, and anyone who's a union member is entitled to a free print subscription.
A free print subscription for union members. That's awesome.
Yeah. And you can find all that information on our website, but that's a really sweet deal. We put a lot of work into the print magazine. I think my hope is that people would like it if they decided to sign up for the free.
Right on. Let's talk. You write a lot about, you write about all kinds of things. I mean, domestic politics, international politics. But if there's two, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the two sort of main veins in which you write are through or about labor and militarism. You talked to us a little bit, obviously, about your personal background. All of that makes a lot more sense talking about or thinking about your personal background and then the activism that you've been involved with. But tell me a little bit about why those two issues matter to you today, how you've been thinking about them, writing about them, reporting on them today that I'm assuming is different than what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 15 or 20 years ago.
Yeah. Labor appeals to me as a topic to write about because I am a big fan of reporting that's rooted in examining the material reality of ordinary people in the day-to-day. What you do at work, where you work, how you organize at work, how your bosses treat you, is a defining feature of many of our lives and is incredibly important and often overlooked. And I think that any mass movement in the US, for it to be successful, has to involve the labor movement in some way. I don't want to idealize the labor movement. There are problems. There are ways that it needs to be pushed. We've been doing a lot of coverage about the growing call to expel police unions from the AFL-CIO, something that's getting a ton of attention right now thanks to the nationwide multiracial uprising being led by Black people across the country. And so I'm really interested in this conversation of both how you build up the labor movement and how you push it to take on a truly social justice stance. I write about militarism because internationalism has to be a component of that. Otherwise, you're building your gains on the backs of other people. You can't talk about gains for U.S. workers or poor people or oppressed people in the U.S. without looking at the international role the U.S. plays. I think that I believe in sort of radical equality, this idea that every human life matters the same regardless of where you happen to live or where you happen to have been born or what country you're a citizen of. And so if you hold that that's true, then doing critical reporting of U.S. war and militarism becomes very, very important. And I think it's especially important now because we're living at a time where, the left is resurgent. Things that seemed beyond the political pale a few years ago, like Medicare for all, are now in the national conversation. Even if they're not winning, they're being talked about. Mm-hmm. And we have to make sure that, we're not just fighting for progressive domestic gains. We're also fighting to take the U.S.'s boot off of the neck of people around the world. Part of my concern about that is that in the U.S., there's this particular baggage around progressives where their fight for domestic gains comes at the expense of other people. I think one of the clearest examples is Lyndon B. Johnson, who sort of created the war on poverty at the same time that he was escalating the U.S. war in Vietnam. He even described what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam as exporting the Great Society to Vietnam. We now know that, and people knew at the time that was total BS and that what was happening was a horrific, unjust massacre and slaughter. And so I think that we have to be really aware of that baggage and make sure that we're not replicating it and make sure that nothing comes at the expense of people in other parts of the world.
What do you make? I mean, I kind of think of this also with Obama, where there was hope, I think, domestically. I mean, I do think that there were a lot of people. I mean, there was what it meant symbolically to get the first African-American person elected president. But then also domestically, there seemed to be hope for people where they were saying, okay, like, at least we can get a little better health care. I know a lot of people didn't like Obamacare, but we also know that a ton of people actually benefited from it. We also both agree that it wasn't enough and all the rest. So we don't even have to get into all of that. But just that dynamic of like, you know, you had the Susan Rices and Samantha Powers, Rahm Emanuel's, like the humanitarian interventionists, some of whom go all the way back to the Clinton era. Some even precede that era. But yeah, I wonder what you think. It seems to me that if Joe Biden gets elected, that he's not going to have nearly the sort of honeymoon that Obama enjoyed. Do you read that the same way? Like if he ends up getting in, which I'm not banking on him doing that, but I think it's probably 50-50 and contingent upon what we do over the next several months. Or if you maybe don't agree that that's the way to go. What do you make? It wasn't in a line of questioning that I was thinking of before this, but I'm interested in what you think about how the left could react to a potential Biden presidency and just how you process the coming election.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are in a really hard spot right now because Bernie Sanders, while imperfect, when he was a leading contender or the leading contender for the Democratic ticket, the left was still in play, and we're not really in play anymore in the same way. And I think it's a really hard moment. You know, my general approach to the election is we need Trump out. And I think I'm a big believer in negative campaigns based on getting a horrific person out of an office. But I think that a Biden administration would have to, the left will have to be rigorous and relentless in watching what it does, especially with foreign policy. I mean, Biden really stood out among the Democratic field for being to the right on foreign policy. He's also made it a defining issue of his legacy. It's what he's campaigning on. A lot of the public statements he's made since being the presumptive nominee have been hawkish, anti-China rhetoric, trying to outdo Trump on that front, which he hasn't been able to outdo because Trump is so horrifically racist against Chinese people, but nonetheless using some similar rhetoric. He refused to even call for unequivocally for sanctions against Iran to be lifted during the pandemic, even though the supposed flagship achievement of the Obama-Biden administration was the Iran deal, which gave sanctions relief. So you'd think that would be a low bar, but he did not meet it. There's also reason to be concerned about the foreign policy people that he's surrounding himself with. There's been some media coverage lately of Avril Haines. She's just one of the sort of foreign policy people who he's surrounding himself with. And, she oversaw Obama's drone kill list, and she opposed the release of the torture report and then pushed for heavy redactions. I think that unfortunately, I'm not actually seeing a ton of signs that the potential Biden administration is being pushed from the left when it comes to foreign policy. There was a lot of sort of fuss made about the Biden and Sanders joint task force where like progressive ideas were going to be cooked up, and it does not even mention war and militarism at all. So I think that we are going to have to be watching very, very closely. I think people know that. I think the fact that Biden supported the Iraq War, he didn't just support it, he was a pretty powerful voice in leading Democrats to support that war. The fact that he's so staunchly against Palestinian rights and has been throughout his entire career. I don't think people have any illusions. He's not like Obama, who sort of ran on an anti-war ticket and then was very disappointing. Instead, Biden is like very obviously, a hawkish Democrat if you look at his record. So my hope is that people are aware of this and are energized and are ready to mobilize demand that there not be any wars, to also just like closely follow his personnel and demand that people with horrific records not be included in his personnel. I think all of that's going to be important.
Yeah. I mean, one of the main reasons, I mean, I think two things that I generally agree with the concept of strategic voting in most places. And I think in the absence of a viable third party and within the U.S. electoral structure and system, it doesn't seem clear to me that that's going to be the case anytime soon, having a real viable alternative. So I agree with, I'm sort of glad that Jacobin and other groups and DSA and other organizations have sort of taken the approach they've taken in the short term. Now that may change over time, but I think in the short term, particularly building off of Sanders in 2015 and 16, I think it made a lot of sense. I wonder if, let me put it this way. Two issues that I think is like sort of the pathway to talk to people about Biden. One is, I think I've seen a lot of people's minds change in the course of this pandemic. So I think people who otherwise were like, you know what, they screwed Bernie, or we didn't have enough support, or however they interpreted the loss, and then, you know, fuck it, I'm not voting for Joe Biden. But then the pandemic happens, and I've had friends on the left be like, you know what, I'd rather have this technocratic neoliberal who actually might have people who can run the state apparatus in charge of a pandemic, as opposed to like witch doctors and people who don't even believe in the science. That seems to make sense. But then the other line, I think, or the approach that I've been trying to take with people is, let's say all policies are even or equally as bad. We know that that's not the case, but let's say all personnel and policies are equally as bad between Trump and Biden. It seems to me that make a lot of sense to disempower the white nationalists who've been empowered by Trump's presidency. So if for no other reason, if you don't even like forego the Supreme Court, everything else, it seems really important to get Trump out of office, if for no other reason than to take away the mantle from what has empowered some of the most regressive, reactionary elements in the society. I mean, is that something you would agree with, or how do you process just this getting rid of Trump? Because we know, you know, and I know that that's not enough, but I actually do think, and as time goes on, I find it more and more important to make sure that we get him out of the White House in November.
It's important. It's important. I think those reasons you said make a lot of sense. I think his, his just wildly incompetent and callous approach to the pandemic, in which he's embraced the mass death of, people from the virus, which we know is going to impact Black and brown and poor people the most, is just horrifying. It's still playing out. We don't even know what's going to happen. It's really scary. It's this feeling of just total free fall. Millions and millions of people in complete free fall. And I think that at the same time, in this moment, he's clearly ginning up his racist base as a campaign strategy. You know, his recent comments about far left fascism needs to be opposed, but then at the same time he's creating, anti-fascist as a bogeyman, and just saying, using incitement against Black Lives Matter and against anti-police protests. I mean, it's beyond the pale. I also want to say, I think that it's important to go into this election and into, the next year being very real about how Biden's base is also, has a lot of, there are a lot of bipartisan supporters of the pro-war consensus who are really backing Biden, and we have to watch out for those people. We have to be paying attention to how Biden is also, in some ways, stoking xenophobia, as we saw with his ads against China. And so, unfortunately, Trump has moved everything so far to the right that Biden really reflects that. It doesn't, but Trump is still further right. But there are areas when it comes to foreign policy, Biden is really belligerent. he's had a lot of opportunities to oppose Trump's very right-wing positions, for example, his maximum pressure sanctions on Iran, and he hasn't really taken it in any meaningful way. So I think we just have to be sober about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask you it seems to maybe not make sense to go dive into a detailed article that you did after sort of talking about all these broad issues. So maybe we can maybe in a few months or so, we can do like an interview and just go through some of your articles. But I would be interested in like a couple things. One, what are you working on right now? Or do you have anything in the mix that you're sort of thinking about writing? What's your next piece? If you can give us any hints about what it's going to be. And then just any kind of parting thoughts that you have. I mean, there's also a lot of, I know some of the people we've interviewed have been reluctant to give advice, but I don't want you to be. In other words, I think there's a lot of young people coming into the mix right now. They don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be told this or that. But I do think that it helps to hear from people who have maybe been around a little bit, like just some advice, parting thoughts on sort of where we're headed, stuff you're working on, and any advice you would have for people who are just coming into the mix. And there are a lot of new people. I mean, just to give you a sense, in Northwest Indiana, we had close to 1,000 people in Hammond show up to a rally. We had 700 people in Michigan City. These are cities of like 50, 40, 30,000 people. We had rallies in Portage, Indiana, LaPorte, Indiana, Lake Station. I mean, I know this is the case everywhere, but I've never seen anything like this in my life here in the region. We're obviously hoping to build on this, but there's a lot of new people coming into the mix, and I think it would be, my whole goal with this is like not to tell them what to do, but to get them to avoid hopefully making all the mistakes that I made along the way. So it's like, but yeah, just any kind of parting thoughts, what you're working on, and advice you might have for folks.
Yeah, so I'm working on a piece that I'm excited about. I interviewed a scholar, Benjamin Balthazar. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But he wrote this really fascinating piece about the history of Jewish anti-Zionism on the left in the 1930s and the 1940s. There is a very rich history of leftist Jewish anti-Zionism, which is very important because it sort of subverts this idea that Zionism reflects the will of all Jewish people. And I think that that's a very important history to pull out right now because, as I'm sure you know, Israel has this plan, Netanyahu specifically has a plan to annex up to 30% of Palestinian land. It's a violent continuation of longstanding, land theft, expulsions, treating Palestinians like either second-class citizens or people to be violently subjugated and dominated. And so I think that it's an important time right now to sort of reconnect with and reclaim this rich history of working-class Jewish left anti-Zionism. So that's one thing I'm excited about that I'm working on. Oh man, as far as advice, I think I just really want to thank people who are doing amazing organizing right now. I mean, people who are taking to the streets to protest police violence and anti-Black racism in society overall. They're risking their lives by doing so. They're doing it in a pandemic. They're being really brave. They're doing it because they've decided that this is so important that it's worth taking risks for. Thankfully, there are signs that mask wearing at protests is helping stop the spread, so I don't want to overstate it, but I just want to say that these are very bleak times, and the people who are really being incredibly courageous and braving beatings and tear gassing and going out even though they're having trouble making ends meet and might be broke or might be homeless or maybe just got fired or laid off. But they keep showing up again and again and again, and it's incredibly powerful. It's the ray of hope in a really difficult time, and I just hope that they keep pushing the bounds of what we thought was possible and that they keep fighting, and I'm just really appreciative of everyone doing that.
Right on. That's a great way to end. Well, I appreciate your time, Sarah. It's good to catch up with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really good to talk.
You've been watching Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we'll see you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parcmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Parc Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.